Part 1 of Chapter 7 of The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Translated by William Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. Part 1 of Chapter 7. First subdivision of logic. The doctrine of being. Being is the notion implicit only. Its special forms have the predicate is. When they are distinguished, they are each of them an other, and the shape which dialectic takes in them, i.e. their further specialization, is a passing over into another. This further determination or specialization is at once a forth-putting, and in that way a disengaging of the notion implicit in being, and at the same time the withdrawing of being inwards, its sinking deeper into itself. Thus the explication of notion in the sphere of being does two things. It brings out the totality of being, and it abolishes the immediacy of being, or the form of being as such. Being itself and the special subcategories of it which follow, as well as those of the logic in general, may be looked upon as definitions of the Absolute, or metaphysical definitions of God. At least the first and third category in every triad may. The first, where the thought form of the triad is formulated in its simplicity, and the third, being the return from differentiation to a simple self-reference. For a metaphysical definition of God is the expression of his nature in thoughts as such, and logic embraces all thoughts so long as they continue in the thought form. The second subcategory in each triad, where the grade of thought is in its differentiation, gives on the other hand a definition of the finite. The objection to the form of definition is that it implies a something in the mind's eye on which these predicates may fasten. Thus even the Absolute, though it purports to express God in the style and character of thought, in comparison with its predicate, which really and distinctly expresses in thought what the subject does not, is as yet only an inchoate pretended thought, the indeterminate subject of predicates yet to come. The thought which is here and the matter of sole importance is contained only in the predicate, and hence the propositional form, like the said subject, viz. The Absolute, is a mere superfluity. Each of the three spheres of the logical idea proves to be a systematic whole of thought terms, and a phase of the Absolute. This is the case with being, containing the three grades of quality, quantity, and measure. Quality is, in the first place, the character identical with being, so identical that a thing ceases to be what it is if it loses its quality. Quantity, on the contrary, is the character external to being, and does not affect the being at all. Thus, for example, a house remains what it is, whether it be greater or smaller, and red remains red, whether it be brighter or darker. Measure, the third grade of being, which is a unity of the first two, is a qualitative quantity. All things have their measure, i.e. the quantitative terms of their existence. Their being so or so great does not matter within certain limits, but when these limits are exceeded by an additional more or less, the things cease to be what they were. From measure follows the advance to the second subdivision of the idea, essence. The three forms of being here mentioned, just because they are the first, are also the poorest, i.e. the most abstract. Immediate, sensible consciousness, insofar as it simultaneously includes an intellectual element, is especially restricted to the abstract categories of quality and quantity. The sensuous consciousness is in ordinary estimation the most concrete and thus also the richest, but that is only true as regards to materials, whereas in reference to the thought it contains, it is really the poorest and most abstract. A. Quality. Being. Pure being makes the beginning, because it is on one hand pure thought, and on the other immediacy itself, simple and indeterminate. The first beginning cannot be mediated by anything, or be further determined. All doubts and admonitions which might be brought against beginning the science with abstract empty being will disappear, if we only perceive what a beginning naturally implies. It is impossible to define being as I equals I, as absolute indifference, or identity, and so on. Where it is felt necessary to begin either with what is absolutely certain, i.e. the certainty of oneself, or with the definition or intuition of the absolute truth, these and other forms of the kind may be looked on as if they must be the first. But each of these forms contains a mediation, and hence cannot be the real first. For all mediation implies advance made from a first on to a second, and proceeding from something different. If I equals I, or even the intellectual intuition, are really taken to mean no more than the first, they are in this mere immediacy identical with being, which conversely, pure being, if abstract no longer, but including in it mediation, is pure thought or intuition. If we enunciate being as a predicate of the Absolute, we get the first definition of the latter. The Absolute is being. This is, in thought, the absolutely initial definition, the most abstract and stinted. It is the definition given by the Eleatics, but at the same time it is also a well-known definition of God as the sum of all realities. It means, in short, that we are to set aside that limitation which is in every reality, so that God shall be only the real in all reality, the superlatively real. Or if we reject reality as implying a reflection, we get a more immediate or unreflected statement of the same thing. When Jacobi says the God of Spinoza is the principium of being in all existence. When thinking is to begin, we have nothing but thought in its merest indeterminateness. For we cannot determine unless there is both one and another, and in the beginning there is yet no other. The indeterminate, as we here have it, is the blank we begin with, not a featureless reached by abstraction, not the elimination of all character, but the original featurelessness which precedes all definite character and is the very first of all. And this we call being. It is not to be felt or perceived by sense or pictured in imagination, and as such it forms the beginning. Essence also is indeterminate, but in another sense it has traversed the process of mediation and contains implicit the determination it has absorbed. In the history of philosophy, the different stages of the logical idea assume the shape of successive systems, each based on a particular definition of the Absolute. As the logical idea is seen to unfold itself in a process from the abstract to the concrete, so in the history of philosophy, the earliest systems are the most abstract, and thus at the same time the poorest. The relation too of the earlier to the later systems of philosophy is much like the relation of the corresponding stages of the logical idea. In other words, the earlier are preserved in the later, but subordinated and submerged. This is the true meaning of a much misunderstood phenomenon in the history of philosophy, the refutation of one system by another, of an earlier by a later. Most commonly the refutation is taken in a purely negative sense, to mean the system refuted has ceased to count for anything, has been set aside and done for. Were it so, the history of philosophy would be of all studies most saddening, displaying, as it does, the refutation of every system which time has brought forth. Now, although it may be admitted that every philosophy has been refuted, it must be in an equal degree maintained that no philosophy has been refuted, nay, or can be refuted, and that in two ways. For first, every philosophy that deserves the name always embodies the idea, and secondly, every system represents one particular factor, or particular stage, in the evolution of the idea. The refutation of a philosophy, therefore, only means that its barriers are crossed, and its special principle reduces to a factor in the completer principle that follows. Thus, the history of philosophy, in its true meaning, deals not with a past, but with an eternal and veritable present, and in its results resembles not a museum or the aberrations of the human intellect, but a pantheon of godlike figures. These figures of God are the various stages of the idea, as they come forward one after another in a dialectical development. To the history of philosophy, it belongs to point out more precisely how far the gradual evolution of this theme coincides with, or swerves from, the dialectical unfolding of the pure logical idea. It is sufficient to mention here that logic begins where the proper history of philosophy begins. Philosophy began in the Eleatic school, particularly with Parmenides. Parmenides, who conceives the Absolute as being, says that being alone is, and nothing is not. Such was the true starting point of philosophy, which is always knowledge by thought. And here for the first time we find pure thought seized and made an object to itself. Men indeed thought from the beginning, for thus only were they distinguished from the animals. But thousands of years had to elapse before they came to apprehend thought in its purity, and to see in it the truly objective. The Eleatics are celebrated as daring thinkers, but this nominal admiration is often accompanied by the remark that they went too far, when they made being alone true and denied truth of every other object of consciousness. We must go further than mere being, it is true, and yet it is absurd to speak of the other contents of our consciousness as something what, as it were, outside and beside being, or to say that the other things as well as being. The true state of the case rather is as follows. Being, as being, is nothing fixed or ultimate. It yields to dialectic and sinks into opposite, which, also taken immediately, is nothing. After all, the point is that being is the first pure thought. Whatever else you may begin with, the I equals I, the absolute indifference, or God himself, you begin with a figure of materialized conception, not a product of thought. And that, so far as its thought content is concerned, such beginning is merely being. But this mere being, as it is mere abstraction, is therefore the absolutely negative, which in a similarly immediate aspect is just nothing. Hence was derived the second definition of the absolute. The absolute is the not. In fact, this definition is implied in saying that the thing in itself is the indeterminate, utterly without form and so without content, or in saying that God is only the supreme being and nothing more, for this is really declaring him to be the same negativity as above. The nothing, which the Buddhist monks make the universal principle, as well as the final aim and goal of everything, is the same abstraction. If opposition in thought is stated in this immediacy as being and nothing, the shock of its nullity is too great not to stimulate the attempt to fix being and secure it against the transition into nothing. With this intent, reflection has recourse to the plan of discovering some fixed predicate for being, to mark it off from nothing. Thus we find being identified with what persists amid all the change, with matter, susceptible of innumerable determinations, or even, unreflectingly, with a single existence, any chance object of the senses or of the mind. But every additional and more concrete characterization causes being to lose that integrity and simplicity it has in the beginning. Only in and by virtue of this mere generality is it nothing, something else inexpressible, whereof the distinction from nothing is a mere intention or meaning. All that is wanted is to realize that these beginnings are nothing but the empty abstractions, one as empty as the other. The instinct that induces us to attach a settled import to being or to both is the very necessity which leads to the onward movement of being and nothing, and gives them a true or concrete significance. This advance in the logical deduction and the movement of thought exhibited in the sequel. The reflection, which finds a profounder connotation for being and nothing, is nothing but logical thought, through which such connotations is evolved, not, however, in an accidental, but a necessary way. Every signification, therefore, in which they afterwards appear, is only a more precise specification and truer definition of the absolute. And when that is done, the mere abstract being and nothing are replaced by a concrete in which both these elements form an organic part. The supreme form of not as separate principle would be freedom, but freedom is negativity in that stage when it sinks self-absorbed to supreme intensity, and is itself an affirmation, and even an absolute affirmation. The distinction between being and not is, in the first place, only implicit and not yet actually made. They only ought to be distinguished. A distinction of course implies two things, and that one of them possesses an attribute which is not found in the other. Being, however, is an absolute absence of attributes, and so is not. Hence the distinction between the two is only meant to be. It is a quite nominal distinction, which is at the same time no distinction. In all other cases of difference, there is some common point which comprehends both things. Suppose, for example, we speak of two different species. The genus forms a common ground for both. But in case of mere being and nothing, distinction is without a bottom to stand upon. Hence there can be no distinction, both determinations being the same bottomlessness. If it be replied that being and nothing are both of them thoughts, so that thought may be reckoned common ground, the objector forgets that being is not a particular or definite thought, and hence being quite indeterminate is a thought not to be distinguished from nothing. It is natural too for us to represent being as absolute riches and nothing absolute poverty. But if when we view the whole world we can only say everything is and nothing more, we are neglecting all specialty, and instead of absolute plenitude we have absolute emptiness. The same stricture is applied to those who define God to be mere being, a definition not a whit better than of the Buddhists who make God to be not, and who from that principle draw further conclusion that self-annihilation is the means by which man becomes God. Nothing, if it be thus immediate and equal to itself, is also conversely the same as being is. The truth of being and of nothing is accordingly the unity of the two, and the unity is becoming. The proposition that being and nothing is the same seems so paradoxical to the imagination or understanding that it is perhaps taken for a joke. And indeed it is one of the hardest things thought expects itself to do. For being and nothing exhibit the fundamental contrast in all its immediacy, that is, without one term being invested with any attribute which would involve its connection with another. This attribute, however, as the above paragraph points out, is implicit in them, the attribute which is just the same in both. So far as the deduction of their unity is completely analytical, indeed the whole progress of philosophizing in every case, if it be a methodical, that is to say, necessary progress, merely renders explicit what is implicit in a notion. It is as correct, however, to say that being and nothing are altogether different as to assert their unity. The one is not what the other is, but simply the distinction has not at this point assumed definite shape. It is, in the way they have it, something unutterable, which we merely mean. No great expenditure of wit is needed to make fun of the maxim that being and nothing are the same, or rather adduce absurdities which, it is erroneously asserted, are the consequence and illustrations of that maxim. If being and nothing are identical, say these objectors, it follows that it makes no difference whether my home, my property, the air I breathe, this city, the sun, the law, mind, God, are or are not. Now, in some of these cases, the objectors foist in private aims the utility a thing has for me, and then ask whether it to be all the same to me if the thing exists or if it do not. For that matter, indeed, the teaching of philosophy is precisely what frees man from the endless crowd of finite aims and intentions, by making him so insensible to them that their existence or non-existence is to him a matter of indifference. But it is never to be forgotten that, once mention something substantial, you thereby create a connection with other existences and other purposes, which are ex hypothesi worth having. And on such hypothesis it comes to depend whether being and not being of a determinate subject are the same or not. A substantial distinction in these cases secretly substituted for the empty distinction of being and not. In others of the cases referred to, it is virtually absolute existence and vital ideas and aims which are placed under the mere category of being or not being. But there is more to be said of these concrete objects than that they merely are or are not. Barren abstractions like being and nothing, the initial categories which, for that reason, are the scantiest anywhere to be found, are utterly inadequate to the nature of these objects. Substantial truth is something far above these abstractions and their positions, and always when a concrete existence is distinguished under the name of being and not being, empty-headedness makes its usual mistake of speaking about and having in the mind an image of something else than what is in question, and in this place the question is about abstract being and nothing. It may perhaps be said that nobody can form a notion of the unity of being and not. As for that, the notion of the unity is stated in the sections preceding, and that is all. Apprehend that, and you have comprehended this unity. What the objector really means by comprehension, by a notion, is more than his language properly implies. He wants a richer and more complex state of mind, a pictorial conception which will profound the notion as concrete case and one more familiar to the ordinary operations of thought. And so long as incomprehensibility means only the want of habituation for the effect needed to grasp an abstract thought, free from all sensuous admixture, and to seize the speculative truth, the reply to the criticism is that philosophical knowledge is undoubtedly distinct in kind from the mode of knowledge best known in common life, as well as that which reigns in the other sciences. But if to have no notion merely means that we cannot represent in imagination the oneness of being and not, the statement is far from being true, for everyone has countless ways of envisaging this unity. To say that we have no such conception can only mean that in none of these images do we recognize the notion in question, and that we are not aware that they exemplify it. The readiest example of it is becoming. Every one has a mental idea of becoming, and will even allow that it is one idea. He will further allow that when it is analysed, it involves the attributes of being, and also in the very reverse of being, viz. Nothing, and that these two attributes lie undivided in one idea, so that becoming is the unity of being and nothing. Another tolerably plain example is the beginning. In the beginning, the thing is not yet, but it is more than merely nothing, for its being is already in the beginning. Beginning is itself a case of becoming, only the former term is employed with an eye to further advance. If we were to adapt logic to the more usual method of the sciences, we might start with the representation of a beginning as abstractly thought, or with beginning as such, and then analyse this representation. And perhaps people would more readily admit, as a result of this analysis, that being and nothing present themselves as undivided in unity. It remains to note that such phrases as being and nothing are the same, or the unity of being and nothing, like all other such unities, that of subject and object, and others, give rise to reasonable objection. They misrepresent the facts by giving an exclusive prominence to the unity, and leaving the difference which undoubtedly exists in it. Because it is being and nothing, for example, the unity of which is declared, without any express mention or notice, it accordingly seems as if diversity had been unduly put out of court and neglected. The fact is, no speculative principle can be correctly expressed by any such propositional form, for the unity has to be conceived in the diversity, which is all the while present and explicit. To become is the true expression for the resultant of to be and not to be. It is the unity of the two. But not only is it the unity, it is also the inherent unrest. The unity, which is no mere reference to self, and therefore without movement, but which, through the diversity of being and nothing that is in it, it is at war within itself. Determinate being, on the other hand, is this unity, or becoming, in this form of unity. Hence all that is there and so is one-sided and finite. The opposition between the two factors seems to have vanished. It is only implied in the unity, it is not explicitly put in it. The maxim of becoming, that being is the passage into not, and not the passage into being, is controverted by a maxim of pantheism, the doctrine of eternity of matter, that from nothing comes nothing, and something can only come out of something. The ancients saw plainly that the maxim, from nothing comes nothing, from something something, really abolishes becoming, for what it comes from and what it becomes are one and the same. Thus explained, the proposition is the maxim of abstract identity as upheld by the understanding. It cannot but seem strange, therefore, to hear such maxims as out of nothing comes nothing, out of something comes something, calmly taught in these days without the teacher being in at least aware that they are the basis of pantheism, and even without his knowing that the ancients have exhausted all this to be said about them. Becoming is the first concrete thought, and therefore the first notion, whereas being and nothing are empty abstractions. The notion of being, therefore, of which we sometimes speak, must mean becoming, not the mere point of being, which is empty nothing, any more than nothing, which is empty being. In being, then, we have nothing, and in nothing, being. But this being, which does not lose itself in nothing, is becoming. Nor must we omit the distinction while we emphasize the unity of becoming. Without that distinction, we should once more return to abstract being. Becoming is only the explicit statement of what being is in its truth. We often hear it maintained that thought is opposed to being. Now, in the face of such a statement, our first question ought to be, what is meant by being? If we understand being as it is defined by reflection, all that we can say of it is that what is wholly identical and affirmative. And if we look at thought, it cannot escape us that thought is also at least what is absolutely identical with itself. Both, therefore, being as well as thought, have the same attribute. This identity of being and thought is not, however, to be taken in a concrete sense, as if we could say that a stone, so far as it has being, is the same as a thinking man. A concrete thing is always very different from the abstract category as such, and in the case of being, we are speaking of nothing concrete, for being is utterly abstract. So far then the question regarding the being of God, a being which is in itself concrete above all measure, is of slight importance. As the first concrete thought term, becoming is the first adequate vehicle of truth. In the history of philosophy, this logical idea finds its analogue in the system of Heraclitus. When Heraclitus says, all is flowing, he enunciates becoming as the fundamental feature of all existence, whereas the Eleatics, as already remarked, saw the only truth in being, rigid, processless being. Glancing at the principle of the Eleatics, Heraclitus then goes on to say, being no more is than not being, a statement expressing the negativity of abstract being, and its identity with not being as made explicit in becoming, both abstractions being alike untenable. This may be looked at as an instance of the real refutation of one system by another. To refute a philosophy is to exhibit the dialectical movement in its principle, and thus reduce it to a constituent member of a higher concrete form of the idea. Even becoming, however, taken at its best on its own ground, is an extremely poor term. It needs to grow in depth and weight of meaning. Such deepened force we find, for example, in life. Life is a becoming, but that is not enough to exhaust the notion of life. A still higher form is found in mind. Here too is becoming, but richer and more intensive than mere logical becoming. These elements, whose unity constitutes mind, are not bare abstractions of being and of not, but the systems of logical idea and of nature. Being determinate. In becoming, the being which is one with nothing, and the nothing which is one with being, are only vanishing factors. They are and they are not. Thus, by its inherent contradiction, becoming collapses into the unity in which the two elements are absorbed. The result is accordingly being determinate, being there and so. In the first example we must call to mind once for all what was stated in the note. The only way to secure any growth and progress in knowledge is to hold results fast in their truth. There is absolutely nothing whatever in which we cannot and must not point to contradictions or opposite attributes, and the abstraction made by understanding therefore means a forcible insistence on a single aspect, and a real effort to obscure and remove all consciousness of the other attribute which is involved. Whenever such contradiction, then, is discovered in any object or notion, the usual inference is, hence, this object is nothing. Thus Zeno, who first showed the contradiction native to motion, concluded that there is no motion, and the ancients, who recognised origin and decease, the two species of becoming, as untrue categories, made use of the expression that the one, or absolute, neither arises nor perishes. Such a style of dialectic looks only at the negative aspect of its results, and fails to notice what is at the same time really present. The definite result in the present case appear nothing, but a nothing which includes being, and in like manner a being which includes nothing. Hence being determinate is one, the unity of being and nothing, in which we get rid of the immediacy in these determinations, and their contradiction vanishes in their mutual connection, the unity in which they are only constituent elements, and two, since the result is the abolition of the contradiction, it comes in the shape of simple unity with itself. That is to say, it is also being, but being with negation or determinateness. It is becoming expressly put in the form of one of its elements, viz. Being. Even our ordinary conception of becoming implies that somewhat comes out of it, and that becoming therefore has a result. But this conception gives rise to the question, how becoming does not remain mere becoming, but as a result. The answer to this question follows from what becoming has already shown itself to be. Becoming always contains being and nothing in such a way that these two are always changing into each other, and reciprocally concealing each other. Thus becoming stands before us in this abstract restlessness. For since being and nothing vanish in becoming, and that is the very notion of becoming, the latter must vanish also. Becoming is as it were a fire which dies out in itself when it consumes its material. The result of this process, however, is not an empty nothing, but being identical with the negation, what we call being determinate, being then and there, the primary import of which evidently is that it has become. Determinate being is being with a character or mode which simply is, and such unmediated character is quality, and as reflected into itself in this its character or mode, determinate being is somewhat an existent. The categories which issued by a closer analysis of determinate being need only be mentioned briefly. Quality may be described as the determinate mode immediate and identical with being, as distinguished from quantity to come afterwards, which, although a mode of being, is no longer immediately identical with being, but a mode indifferent and external to it. A something is what it is in virtue of its quality, and losing its quality it ceases to be what it is. Quality, moreover, is completely a category only of the finite, and for that reason, too, it has its proper place in nature, not in the world of mind. Thus, for example, in nature, what are styled the elementary bodies, oxygen, nitrogen, etc., should be regarded as existing qualities. But in the sphere of mind, quality appears in a subordinate way only, and not as if its qualitativeness could exhaust any specific aspect of mind. If, for example, we consider the subjective mind which forms the object of psychology, we may describe what is called moral and mental character, as in logical language identical with quality. This, however, does not mean that character is a mode of being which pervades the soul and is immediately identical with it, as is the case in the natural world with the elementary bodies before mentioned. Yet a more distinct manifestation of quality as such, in mind even, is found in the case of besotted or morbid conditions, especially in states of passion when the passion rises to derangement. The state of mind of deranged person, being one mass of jealousy, fear, etc., may suitably be described as quality. Quality, as determinateness which is, as contrasted with the negation which is involved in it but distinguished from it, is reality. Negation is no longer an abstract nothing, but as a determinate being, and somewhat is only a form on such being. It is as otherness. since this otherness, though a determination of quality itself, is in the first instance distinct from it. Quality is being for another, an expansion of the mere point of determinate being or of somewhat. The being, as such, of quality, contrasted with this reference to something else, is being by self. The foundation of all determinateness is negation. As Spinoza says, omnis determinato est negatio. The unreflecting observer supposes that determinate things are merely positive and pins them down under the form of being. Mere being, however, is not the end of the matter. It is, as we have already seen, utter emptiness and instability besides. Still, when abstract being is confused in this way with being modified and determinate, it implies some perception of the element of negation. This element is at first wrapped up, as it were, and only comes to the front and receives its due in being for self. If we go on to consider determinate being as determinateness which is, we get in this way what is called reality. We speak, for example, of the reality of a plan or of a purpose, meaning thereby that they are no longer inner and subjective, but have passed into being there and then. In the same sense, the body may be called the reality of the soul, and the law the reality of freedom, and the world altogether the reality of the divine idea. The word reality is, however, used in another acceptation to mean that something behaves conformably to its essential characteristic or notion. For example, we use the expression, this is a real occupation, this is a real man. Here the term does not merely mean outward and immediate existence, but rather that some existence agrees with its notion. In which sense, be it added, reality is not distinct from ideality, which we shall in the first instance become acquainted with in the shape of being for self. Being, if kept distinct and apart from its determinate mode, as it is in being by self, being implicit, would be only the vacant abstraction of being. In being, determinate there and then, the determinateness is one with being. Yet at the same time, when we explicitly made a negation, it is a limit, a barrier. Hence the otherness is not something indifferent and outside it, but a function proper to it. Somewhat is by its quality, firstly finite, secondly alterable, so that finitude and variability appearing to its being. In being there and then, the negation is still directly one with being, and this negation is what we call a limit, boundary. A thing is what it is, only in and by reason of its limit. We cannot therefore regard the limit as only external to being, which is then and there. It rather goes through and through the whole of such existence. The view of limit as merely an external characteristic of being there and then arises from a confusion of quantitative with the qualitative limit. Here we are speaking primarily of the qualitative limit. If, for example, we observe a piece of ground, 3 acres large, that circumstance is quantitative limit. But in addition, the ground is, it may be, a meadow, not a wood or a pond. This is its qualitative limit. Man, if he wishes to be actual, must be there and then, and to this end he must set a limit to himself. People who are too fastidious towards the finite never reach actuality, but linger lost in abstraction, and their light dies away. If we take a closer look at what a limit implies, we see it involving a contradiction in itself, and thus evincing its dialectical nature. On the one side, the limit makes the reality of a thing, on the other it is its negation. But again, the limit as the negation of something is not an abstract nothing, but a nothing which is, what we call an other. Given something, and up starts an other to us. We know that there is not something only, but an other as well. Nor again is the other of such a nature that we can think something apart from it. A something is implicitly the other of itself, and the somewhat sees its limit become objective to it in the other. If we now ask for the difference between something and other, it turns out that they are the same, which sameness is expressed in Latin by calling the pair aliud aliud, the other as opposed to the something. It is itself a something, and hence we say some other, or something else. And so, on the other hand, the first something, when opposed to the other, also defined as something, is itself an other. When we say something else, our first impression is that something taken separately is only something, and that the quality of being another attaches to it only from outside considerations. Thus we might suppose that the moon, being something else than the sun, might very well exist without the sun, but really the moon as a something has its other implicit in it. Plato says, God made the world out of the nature of the one and the other. Having brought these together, he formed from them a third, which is of the nature of the one and the other. In these words we have in general terms a statement of nature of the finite, which as something does not meet the nature of the other as if it had no affinity to it, but being implicitly the other of itself, thus undergoes alteration. Alteration thus exhibits the inherent contradiction which originally attaches to determinate being, and which forces it out of its own bounds. To materialized conception, existence stands in the character of something solely positive, and quietly abiding within its own limits. Though we also know it is true that everything finite, such as existence, is subject to change. Such changeableness in existence is only to the superficial eye a mere possibility, the realization of which is not a consequence of its own nature. But the fact is, mutability lies in the notion of existence, and change is only the manifestation of what it implicitly is. The living dies simply because as living they bear in themselves the germ of death. Something becomes another, this other is itself somewhat, therefore it likewise becomes an other, and so on ad infinitum. This infinity is the wrong or negative infinity. It is only a negation of a finite, but the finite rises again the same as ever, and is never got rid of and absorbed. In other words, this infinite only expresses the ought to be elimination of the finite. The progression to infinity never gets further than a statement of the contradiction involved in the finite, that it is somewhat as well as somewhat else. It sets up with endless iteration the alteration between the two terms, each of which calls up the other. If we let somewhat and another, the elements of determinate being, fall asunder, the result is that some becomes other, and this other is itself a somewhat, which then as such changes likewise, and so on ad infinitum. This result seems to superficial reflection something very grand, the grandest possible. But such a progression to infinity is not the real infinite. That consists in being at home with itself in its other, or if enunciated as a process, in coming to itself in its other. Much depends on rightly apprehending the notion of infinity, and not stopping short at the wrong infinity of endless progression. When time and space, for example, are spoken of as infinite, it is in the first place the infinite progression on which our thoughts fasten. We say now, this time, and then we keep continually going forward and backward beyond this limit. The case is the same with space, the infinity of which has formed the theme of barren declamation to astronomers with a talent for edification. In the attempt to contemplate such an infinite, our thoughts, we are commonly informed, must sink exhausted. It is true indeed that we must abandon the unending contemplation, not however because the occupation is too sublime, but because it is too tedious. It is tedious to expatiate the contemplation of this infinite progression, because the same thing is constantly recurring. We lay down a limit, then we pass it. Next we have a limit once more, and so on for ever. All this is but superficial alteration, which never leaves the region of the finite behind. To suppose that by stepping out and away into the infinity we release ourselves from the finite, is in truth but to seek the release which comes by flight. But the man who flees is not yet free. In fleeing he is still conditioned by that from which he flees. If it be also said that the infinite is unattainable, the statement is true, but only because to the idea of infinity has been attached the circumstance of being simply and solely negative. With such empty and other-world stuff, philosophy has nothing to do. What philosophy has to do with is always something concrete and in the highest sense present. No doubt philosophy has also sometimes been set the task of finding an answer to the question, how the infinite comes to the resolution of issuing out of itself. This question, founded, as it is, upon the assumption of a rigid opposition between finite and infinite, may be answered by saying that the opposition is false, and that in point of fact the infinite eternally proceeds out of itself, and yet does not proceed out of itself. If we further say that the infinite is the not finite, we have in point of fact virtually expressed the truth, for the finite itself is the first negative. The not finite is the negative of that negation, the negation which is identical with itself and thus at the same time a true affirmation. The infinity of reflection here discussed is only an attempt to reach the true infinity, a wretched neither one thing nor another. Generally speaking, it is the point of view which has in recent times been emphasized in Germany. The finite, this theory tells us, ought to be absorbed. The infinite ought not to be negative merely, but also a positive. That ought to be betrays the incapacity of actually making good a claim which is at the same time recognised to be right. This stage never passed by the systems of Kant and Fichte so far as ethics are concerned. The utmost to which this way brings us is only the postulate of a never-ending approximation to the law of reason, which postulate has been made an argument for the immortality of soul. What we have now in point of fact before us is that somewhat comes to be another, and that the other generally comes to be another, thus essentially relative to another. Somewhat is virtually another against it, and since what is passed into is quite the same as what passes over, since both have one and the same attribute, viz. To be another, it follows that something in its passage into other only joins with itself. To be thus self-related in the passage and in the other is the genuine infinity, or under a negative aspect, what is altered is the other. It becomes the other of the other. Thus being, as a negation of the negation, is restored again. It is now being for self. Dualism, in putting an inseparable opposition between finite and infinite, fails to notice the simple circumstances that the infinite is thereby only one of two, and is reduced to a particular, to which finite forms the other particular. Such an infinite, which is only a particular, is coterminous with the finite, which makes for its limit and a barrier. It is not what it ought to be, that is the infinite, but is only finite. In such circumstances, where the finite is on this side and the infinite on that, this world as the finite and the other world as the infinite, an equal dignity of permanence and independence is ascribed to finite and to infinite. The being of the finite is made an absolute being, and by this dualism gets independence and stability. Touched, so to speak, by the infinite, it would be annihilated, but it must not be touched by the infinite. There must be an abyss, an impassable gulf between the two, with the infinite abiding on yonder side and the finite steadfast on this. Those who attribute to the finite this inflexible persistence in comparison with the infinite are not, as they imagine, far above metaphysic. They are still on the level of most ordinary metaphysic of understanding. For the same thing occurs here as in the infinite progression. At one time it is admitted that the finite has no independent actuality, no absolute being, no root and development of its own, but is only a transient. But next moment, this straightway forgotten, the finite, made a mere counterpart to the infinite, wholly separated from it and rescued from annihilation, is conceived to be persistent in its independence. While thought thus imagines itself elevated to the infinite, it meets with the opposite fate. It comes to an infinite which is only a finite, and the finite which it had left behind has always to be retained and made into an absolute. After this examination, with which it were well to compare Plato's Philebus, tending to show the nullity of the distinction made by understanding between the finite and the infinite, we are liable to glide into the statement that the infinite and finite are therefore one, and the genuine infinity, the truth, must be defined and enunciated as the unity of the finite and infinite. Such a statement would be to some extent correct, but is just as open to perversion and falsehood as the unity of being and nothing already noticed. Besides, it may very fairly be charged with reducing the infinite to finitude and making a finite infinite. For so far as the expression goes, the finite seems left in its place and not expressly stated to be absorbed. Or if we reflect that the finite, when identified with the infinite, certainly cannot remain what it is out of such unity, and will at least suffer some change in its characteristics, as an alkali, when combined with an acid, loses some of its properties, we must see that the same fate awaits the infinite, which, as the negative, will on its part likewise have its edge, as it were, taken off on the other. And this does not really happen with the abstract one-sided infinite of understanding. The genuine infinite, however, is not merely in the position of the one-sided acid, and so does not lose itself. The negation of negation is not a neutralization. The infinite is the affirmative, and it is only the finite which is absorbed. In being for self enters the category of ideality. Being there and then, as in the first instance apprehended in its being or affirmation, has reality, and thus even finitude in the first instance is in the category of reality, but the truth of the finite is rather its ideality. Similarly, the infinite of understanding, which is coordinated with the finite, is itself only one of two finites, no whole truth, but a substantial element. This ideality of the finite is the chief maxim of philosophy, and for the reason every genuine philosophy is idealism. But everything depends upon not taking for the infinite what, in the very terms of its characterization, is at the same time made a particular and finite. For this reason we have bestowed a greater amount of attention on this distinction. The fundamental notion of philosophy, the genuine infinite, depends upon it. The distinction is cleared up by the simple, and for that reason seemingly insignificant but incontrovertible reflections contained in the first paragraph of this section. Being for self. Being for self as a reference to itself is immediacy, and as a reference to the negative to itself is a self-subsistent, the one. This unit being without distinction in itself thus excludes the other from itself. To be for self, to be one, is completed quality, and as such contains abstract being and being, modified as non-substantial elements. As simple being, the one is simple self-reference. As being modified, it is determinate. But the determinateness is not in this case a finite determinateness, a somewhat in distinction from another, but infinite because it contains distinction absorbed and annulled in itself. The readiest instance of being for self is found in the I. We know ourselves as existence, distinguished in the first place from other existence and with certain relations thereto. But we also come to know this expansion of existence in these relations reduced, as it were, to a point in the simplest form of being for self. When we say I, we express the reference to self which is infinite, and at the same time negative. Man, it may be said, is distinguished from the animal world, and in that way from nature altogether, by knowing himself as I, which amounts to saying that natural things never attain a free being for self, but is limited to being there and then, or always only being for an other. Again, being for self may be described as ideality, just as being there and then was described as reality. It is said that besides reality there is also ideality. These two categories are made equal and parallel. Properly speaking, ideality is not somewhat outside of and beside reality. The notion of ideality just lies in its being the truth of reality. That is to say, when reality is explicitly put as what it implicitly is, it is at once seen to be ideality. Hence ideality has not received its proper estimation when you allow that reality is not all in all, but that an ideality must be recognised outside of it. Such an ideality external to, or may be even beyond reality, would be no better than an empty name. Ideality only has a meaning when it is the ideality of something. But this something is not a mere indefinite this or that, but existence characterised as reality, which if retained in isolation possesses no truth. The distinction between nature and mind is not improperly conceived when the former is traced back to reality, and the latter to ideality as a fundamental category. Nature, however, is far from being so fixed and complete as to subsist even without mind. A mind at first, as it were, attains its goal and its truth. And similarly, mind on its part is not merely a world beyond nature and nothing more. It is really, and with full proof, seen to be mind only when it involves nature as absorbed in itself. Apropos of this, we should note the double meaning of the German word aufheben, to put by or set aside. When we mean it by one, to clear away or annul, we thus say a law or regulation is set aside. 2, to keep or preserve, in which sense we use it when we say something is well put by. This double usage of language, which gives to the same word a positive and negative meaning, is not an accident, and gives no ground for reproaching language as a cause of confusion. We should rather recognise in it the speculative spirit of our language, rising above the mere either or of understanding. The relation of the negative to itself is a negative relation, and so a distinguishing of the one from itself. The repulsion of the one, that is, makes many ones. So far as regards the immediacy of the self-existence, these many are, and the repulsion of every one of them becomes to that extent their repulsion against each other as existing units, in other words, their reciprocal exclusion. When we speak of the one, the many usually come into our mind at the same time. Whence then, we are forced to ask, do the many come? This question is unanswerable by consciousness, which pictures the many as a primary datum, and treats the one as only one among the many. But the philosophic notion teaches contrariwise, that the one forms the presupposition of the many, and in the thought of the one is implied that it explicitly make itself many. So self-existing unit is not, like being, void of all connective reference. It is a reference as well as being there and then was, not however a reference connecting somewhat with an other, but as a unity of the some and the other. It is a connection with itself, and this connection, be it noted, is a negative connection. Hereby the one manifests an utter incompatibility with itself, a self-repulsion, and what it makes itself explicitly be is the many. We may denote this side in the process of being for self by the figurative term repulsion. Repulsion is a term originally employed in the study of matter, to mean that matter as a many in each of these many ones behaves as exclusive to all the others. It would be wrong, however, to view the process of repulsion as if the one were repellent and the many the repelled. The one, as already remarked, just is self-exclusion and explicit putting itself as the many. Each of the many, however, is itself a one, and in virtue of so behaving, This all-round repulsion is by one stroke converted into its opposite, attraction. But the many are one the same as another. Each is one, or even one of the many. They are consequently one and the same. Or when we study all the repulsion involves, we see the attitude of many ones to one another. It is just as essentially a connective reference to them to each other. And those to which the one is related in its act of repulsion are ones it is in them thrown into relation with itself. The repulsion therefore has an equal right to be called attraction, and the exclusive one or being for self suppresses it. Qualitative character, which in the one or unit has reached the extreme point of its characterization, has thus passed over into determinateness, quality, suppressed, i.e. into being as quantity. The philosophy of the atomists is the doctrine in which the absolute is formulated as being for self, as one and many ones. And it is the repulsion which shows itself in the notion of the one, which is assumed as the fundamental force in these atoms. But instead of attraction it is accident, that is, mere unintelligence which is expected to bring them together. So long as the one is fixed as one, it is certainly impossible to regard its congression with others as anything but external and mechanical. The void, which is assumed as the complementary principle to the atoms, is repulsion and nothing else, present under the image of the nothing existing between the atoms. Modern atomism and physics is still in principle atomistic, has surrendered the atoms so far as to pin its faith on molecules or particles. In so doing, science has come closer to sensuous conception at the cost of losing the precision of thought. To put an attractive by the side of a repulsive force, as the moderns have done, certainly gives completeness to the contrast, and the discovery of this natural force, as it is called, has been a source of much pride. But the mutual implication of the two, which makes what is true and concrete in them, would have to be wrestled from the obscurity and confusion in which they were left even in Kant's metaphysical rudiments of natural science. In modern times, the importance of the atomic theory is more evident in political than in physical science. According to it, the will of individuals as such is the creative principle of the state. The attracting force is the special wants and inclinations of individuals, and the universal, or the state itself, is the external nexus of a compact. The atomic philosophy forms a vital stage in the historical evolution of the idea. The principle of that system may be described as being for itself in the shape of the many. At present, students of nature who are anxious to avoid metaphysics turn a favourable ear to atomism. But it is not possible to escape metaphysics and cease to trace nature back to terms of thought by throwing yourselves into the arms of atomism. The atom in fact is itself a thought, and hence the theory which holds matter to consist of atoms is a metaphysical theory. Newton gave physics an express warning to beware of metaphysics, it is true, but to his honour be it said, he did not by any means obey his own warning. The only mere physicists are the animals. They alone do not think, while man is a thinking being and a born metaphysician. The real question is not whether we shall apply metaphysics, but whether our metaphysics are of the right kind. In other words, whether we are not, instead of concrete logical idea, adopting one-sided forms of thought, rigidly fixed by understanding, and making these the basis of our theoretical as well as our practical work. It is on this ground that one objects to the atomic philosophy. The old atomists viewed the world as a many, as successors often do to this day. On chance they laid the task of collecting the atoms which float about in the void. But after all, the nexus binding the many with one another is by no means a mere accident. As we have already remarked, the nexus is founded on their very nature. To Kant we owe the completed theory of matter as the unity of repulsion and attraction. The theory is correct so far as it recognises attraction to be the other of the two elements involved in the notion of being for self, and to be an element no less essential than repulsion to constituent matter. Still, this dynamical construction of matter, as it is termed, has the fault for taking for granted instead of deducing attraction and repulsion. Had they been deduced, we should then have seen the how and the why of a unity which is merely asserted. Kant indeed was careful to inculcate that matter must not be taken to be existence per se, and then as it were incidentally to be provided with the two forces mentioned, but must be regarded as consisting solely in their unity. German physicists for some time accepted this pure dynamic, but in spite of this the majority of these physicists in modern times have found it more convenient to return to the atomic point of view, and in spite of the warnings of Kessner, one of their number, have begun to regard matter as consisting of infinitesimally small particles, termed atoms, which atoms then have to be brought into relation with one another by the play of forces attached to them, attractive, repulsive, or whatever they may be. This too is metaphysics, and metaphysics for its utter unintelligence, there would be sufficient reason to guard against. The transition from quality to quantity, indicated in the paragraph before us, is not found in our ordinary way of thinking, which deems each of these categories to exist independently beside the other. We are in the habit of saying that things are not merely qualitatively, but also quantitatively defined. But whence these categories originate and how they are related to each other are questions not further examined. The fact is, quantity just means quality superseded and absorbed, and it is by the dialectic of quality here examined that this supersession is effected. First of all we had being. As the truth of being came becoming, which formed the passage into being determinate, and the truth of that we found to be alteration. And in its result alteration showed itself to be being for self, exempt from the implication of another and from passage into another, which being for self finally in the two sides of its process, repulsion and attraction, was clearly seen to annul itself, and thereby to annul quality in the totality of its stages. Still, this superseded and absorbed quality is neither an abstract nothing, nor an equally abstract and featureless being. It is only being as indifferent to determinateness or character. This aspect of being is also what appears as quantity in our ordinary conceptions. We observe things first of all with an eye to their quality, which we take to be the character identical with the being of the thing. If we proceed to consider their quantity, we get the conception of an indifferent and external character or mode, of such a kind that a thing remains what it is, though its quantity is altered, and the thing becomes greater or less. End of Part 1 of Chapter 7. Recording by Ryan Smallwood.